7-year-old Tommy Martinez had never spoken to a stranger in his life. His mother had taught him better than that. But when he saw the 10 motorcycles parked outside Murphy's gas station, something deep in his chest told him these were the kind of men who kept promises. The kind who didn't break their word. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His small hand trembled as he approached the biggest one, a man with silver in his beard and scars on his knuckles. When Tommy whispered those 6 words that would change everything, the man's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "They're hurting Mommy tonight." What happened in the next 8 hours would restore a little boy's faith in heroes and remind 10 hardened men why they rode together in the first place. But before this story goes any further, I want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your city and state in the comments. Whether you're a parent who'd move heaven and earth to protect your child, or someone who believes that real strength means protecting those who can't protect themselves, let me know you're here. This story started with a whisper, but what it became will echo in your heart long after it's over. The bruise on Maria Martinez's wrist was 3 days old, but she'd gotten good at hiding it. Long sleeves in September heat, makeup that covered the fingerprint marks on her throat from 2 weeks ago, sunglasses that hid the fading yellow around her left eye from the accident she'd had walking into a door. Maria was 29 years old and had been beautiful once. The kind of beautiful that made men stop in their tracks and stumble over simple words. She still was beautiful, but now it was a quiet beauty, one that apologized for existing, that tried to take up less space in the world. She worked double shifts at the diner on Route 9, the one truckers stopped at when they needed coffee, strong enough to keep them awake for another 200 miles. The tips were good, better than anything else she was qualified for, with just a high school diploma and 7 years of her life lost to a man who promised to love her but taught her to flinch instead. Tommy was her everything. 7 years old with his father's dark eyes but his mother's gentle heart. He was small for his age, the kind of kid who noticed when people were sad and tried to fix it with crayon drawings and homemade cards that said, "I love you, Mommy," in letters that wandered across the page like they were learning to walk. He was smart, too smart for his own good sometimes. Smart enough to know that when Daddy's truck pulled into the driveway after 10 p.m., it meant he should hide in his closet and cover his ears. Smart enough to know that Mommy's accidents weren't really accidents. Smart enough to know that normal daddies didn't make their mommies cry every night. The apartment they lived in was in the kind of building where neighbors minded their own business, where thin walls carried sound, but nobody asked questions about the yelling, the crashes, the sobbing that came from 2B every few days. Maria paid the rent on time, kept to herself, and that was enough for the landlord to ignore the occasional hole punched in the drywall or the way she sometimes walked with a limp. She tried to leave, twice. The first time, Tommy was 4, and she'd made it 3 states away before Rick found them. He'd been charming at the police station, apologetic, heartbroken, just a misunderstanding, officer. His wife had been struggling with postpartum depression, made some poor choices, but they were working through it. He had the bruises on his knuckles from work, he said. Construction accidents. The officers believed him because he wore a suit and spoke their language, because Maria's English still carried the accent of a childhood spent switching between her grandmother's Spanish and the playground English she'd learned at 7. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second time, she'd made it to a women's shelter 2 towns over. She'd felt safe for 3 weeks, long enough to start believing she could build a different life. But Rick had connections, friends in law enforcement who owed him favors. He'd found her there too, and this time the consequences had been worse. Much worse. That was 2 years ago, and she still had nerve damage in her left hand from what he'd done to remind her that running had consequences. Now, she stayed. Not because she'd stopped dreaming of escape, but because she'd learned that sometimes survival meant choosing the devil you knew over the one that might be worse. At least here, she knew his patterns. Knew that Mondays were usually safe because he was tired from the weekend. Knew that Fridays were dangerous because payday meant drinking money. Knew that the first and third Tuesday of every month were the worst because that's when the mortgage was due on the house he was building with money she helped earn but would never be allowed to enjoy. Tommy knew too. Children always know, even when adults think they're hiding it. He'd developed his own survival strategies. He'd learned to be invisible when Daddy was angry, to make himself small, to speak only when spoken to. He'd learned that if he was very, very good, sometimes Daddy would leave Mommy alone. Not always, but sometimes, and sometimes was enough to make him try. But Tommy was 7, and 7-year-olds aren't meant to carry that kind of weight. The worry was making him thin, making him quiet in school, making him the kind of child teachers noticed and wondered about, but couldn't quite put their finger on what was wrong. 15 miles outside of town, the Iron Phoenix MC was getting ready for their monthly ride. 10 motorcycles sat in formation in the parking lot behind Jake's auto shop, their chrome catching the morning sun like mirrors aimed at heaven. These weren't the kind of bikers you saw in movies. No criminal records, no drug running, no territorial wars with rival clubs. These were working men who'd found brotherhood in the rumble of engines and the freedom of the open road. Men who'd served their country, raised families, built businesses, and understood that real strength wasn't about intimidation. It was about protection. At the head of the formation sat Bear Morrison, though his real name was William. 62 years old, with a gray beard that reached his chest and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 3 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of keeping promises. He'd earned the nickname Bear, not because he was massive though he was, but because he had the kind of protective instinct that made him dangerous to anyone who threatened his family. And the club was family. Bear owned Morrison Construction, employed half the men in the club, and had never missed a child support payment in 35 years, even when his ex-wife remarried and moved across the country. His daughter Sarah called him every Sunday, brought his grandkids to visit every Christmas, and trusted him with her own secrets, because she'd learned early that her father was the kind of man who solved problems instead of creating them. Beside him was Diesel, whose real name was Marcus Rodriguez. Army Rangers, 2 tours in Afghanistan, now a paramedic who worked the night shift at County General. His hands had pulled people back from the edge of death more times than he could count, and those same hands could rebuild a motorcycle engine from scratch or braid his daughter's hair for school pictures. He was the club's medic, the one they called when accidents happened or when someone needed stitches they couldn't explain to a hospital. There was Preacher, James Washington, who'd earned his nickname, not because he was religious, though he was, but because he had a way of talking people down from bad decisions with the patience of a man who'd learned that most anger was just pain wearing a disguise. He'd been a Marine, then a police officer, then a youth minister before he'd burned out on watching kids fall through cracks that society pretended didn't exist. Snake was Tommy Delacroix, though nobody had called him Tommy in 20 years. He'd gotten his nickname in the Navy because he could navigate spaces other men couldn't fit through, but these days he used those skills as a locksmith and security consultant. He was the club's problem solver, the one who could get into places that needed getting into or out of situations that needed getting out of. The others had similar stories. Professional men who'd found something in the brotherhood that they couldn't find anywhere else. A place where your word meant everything and your past was only relevant if it taught you how to be better. They rode together every month. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Because sometimes grown men needed to remember what it felt like to be free, even if it was just for a few hours on a Sunday morning. Their club motto was simple: when all else fails. It was written in script across the bottom of their patch, beneath the Iron Phoenix rising from flames. It meant that when the system failed, when the law wasn't enough, when good people had nowhere else to turn, the Iron Phoenix would be there. Not as vigilantes, not as outlaws, but as men who understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the same as the legal thing to do. They'd used that motto 7 times in the past 5 years. A single mother whose ex-husband was stalking her after the restraining order proved worthless. A veteran being price gouged by a landlord who knew he was desperate. A teenage girl whose stepfather was getting too friendly after her mother died. Each time, they'd found a solution that didn't involve courts or police reports or bureaucrats who cared more about procedures than people. Today was supposed to be different. Today was supposed to be a simple ride through the mountains, a stop for breakfast at Murphy's gas station, maybe a visit to the overlook where you could see 3 states on a clear day. Nobody was supposed to need them today. But sometimes, the universe has other plans. Murphy's gas station sat at the intersection of Route 9 and Old Mill Road, the kind of place that sold lottery tickets and energy drinks and coffee that had been brewing since sometime before dawn. It was owned by Murphy himself, a 70-year-old Irishman who'd bought the place with his retirement money from the railroad and run it with his wife for 15 years until she passed and left him with nothing but memories and a business he kept open, because he didn't know what else to do with his days. The Iron Phoenix pulled in just after 10 a.m. there. Formation perfect, their engines shutting down in sequence, like a carefully choreographed performance. Bear climbed off his bike with the careful movements of a man whose knees remembered Vietnam and whose back remembered 40 years of construction work. The others followed, stretching muscles that had been gripping handlebars for 50 miles of mountain roads. "Coffee's fresh," Murphy called from behind the counter as they filed in. He'd grown to like the bikers over the years. They were polite, paid in cash, and never left a mess. Unlike some of his customers, they treated his place with respect, and respect was something Murphy valued more than money these days. Bear nodded, grabbing a cup and filling it with the black liquid that passed for coffee at most gas stations. It wasn't good, but it was hot, and it had caffeine, and that was enough for a man who'd learned not to be picky about simple pleasures. The others spread out through the small store, some grabbing snacks, others just stretching their legs before the next leg of their ride. That's when Tommy Martinez walked in. He was small, even for 7, wearing clothes that were clean but clearly secondhand. His jeans had been hemmed by someone who knew how to sew but didn't have money for new pants. His sneakers had been white once, but were now the color of playground dirt and broken dreams. He moved through the store with the careful awareness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival. Tommy had been walking for 20 minutes, his small legs carrying him from the apartment complex on Maple Street to this gas station where he'd seen the motorcycles through the window. His mother was at work, wouldn't be home for hours, and wouldn't know he'd left the neighbor's house where she dropped him off with instructions to stay inside and be good. But Tommy couldn't stay inside. Not today, not when he knew what tonight would bring. He'd heard them fighting the night before, heard Rick's voice getting louder, heard his mother's getting quieter, heard the words that meant tonight would be bad, really bad. The kind of bad that left new marks, new bruises, new reasons for his mother to cry when she thought he wasn't listening. Tommy had tried to think of someone to call, someone who could help, but his mother had made him promise never to tell anyone about the fighting. Teachers couldn't know. Neighbors couldn't know. Family couldn't know, because Rick had made it clear what would happen if anyone interfered with their private family business. But these men, these bikers with their leather and their motorcycles and their faces that looked like they'd seen hard things and survived them, maybe they were different. Maybe they were the kind of men who kept their promises. Maybe they were the kind of men who could help when no one else could. Tommy approached the counter, where Bear was paying for his coffee. Up close, the man was even bigger than he'd seemed through the window. His hands were scarred and weathered, the kind of hands that had built things and broken things and held things together when they wanted to fall apart. His eyes were blue-gray, the color of storm clouds, and when they looked down at Tommy, they were kind. "Hey there, son," Bear said, his voice gentle despite its gravelly texture. "You okay?" Tommy opened his mouth to say yes, to give the automatic response he'd been trained to give, but the words that came out were different. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere desperate, somewhere that recognized this moment as possibly his only chance. "They're hurting Mommy tonight." The words hung in the air between them. 6 words that contained a universe of pain, of fear, of a little boy's desperate plea for someone, anyone, to care enough to help. 6 words that would change everything. Bear's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The casual conversation behind him faded as the other members of the Iron Phoenix sensed the shift in energy. the way animals sense an approaching storm. Murphy looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. Bear knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. His voice was soft, careful, the tone a man uses when he knows he's walking through a minefield of a child's trust. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy." "Tommy what?" "Tommy Martinez." Bear nodded, filing the information away. "And who's hurting your mommy?" "Tommy." "Rick, he's not my real daddy, but he lives with us. And when he drinks, he gets mad, and—" Tommy's voice trailed off, his 7-year-old vocabulary insufficient for the realities he'd witnessed. The gas station had gone completely quiet. Murphy was gripping the edge of his counter so hard his knuckles were white. Diesel had moved closer, his paramedic instincts activated by the mention of someone being hurt. Preacher was already reaching for his phone. Not to call the police, not yet, but to start gathering information. Bear studied Tommy's face, looking for signs of abuse, for the telltale marks that would confirm what the boy was saying. He didn't see any physical evidence, but he saw something worse. The hypervigilance of a child who'd learned to read danger in adult voices. The way Tommy's eyes kept darting to the door, as if he expected someone to burst in and drag him away. "Tommy, where's your mommy right now?" "At work. At the diner on Route 9. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at Mrs. Chen's house, but I snuck out because—" Tommy's voice broke. "Because tonight's going to be really bad. Rick lost money at poker last night. And when he loses money, he gets angry. And when he gets angry—" He didn't need to finish. Every man in that gas station understood what he was saying, and every man in that gas station felt something cold and dangerous settle in their chest. Bear stood up slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, through problems and solutions, and the careful calculus of intervention. He'd been in situations like this before, but never with a child involved, never with stakes this high. "Snake," he said quietly, and Tommy Delacroix looked up from the energy drink he'd been pretending to examine. "I need you to make some calls." Quietly. Snake nodded and stepped outside, his phone already in his hand. Within minutes, he'd have information on Rick's last name, address, criminal history, financial records, anything that might be relevant to the situation they were walking into. "Diesel, I need you to take a ride to the diner, check on Tommy's mom without making it obvious. See what she looks like, what kind of shape she's in." Diesel was already moving toward the door. He'd worked enough domestic violence cases as a paramedic to know the signs, to recognize the particular way victims carried themselves when they were living in constant fear. "Preacher, I need you to talk to Mrs. Chen, find out what the neighbor situation is, whether she's seen anything, heard anything." Preacher nodded. As a former police officer, he knew how to conduct interviews that didn't feel like interrogations, how to gather information without raising alarms. Bear turned back to Tommy, who was watching this quiet mobilization with wide eyes. The boy was smart enough to understand that something was happening, that these men were taking his words seriously in a way that adults rarely took children seriously. "Tommy, I need you to tell me everything you can about tonight. What time does Rick usually come home? Does he drink before he comes home or after? Does he have any friends who come over? Does he have weapons in the house?" Tommy answered each question with the careful precision of a child who'd been forced to become an expert in predicting adult behavior. Rick came home between 9 and 10 p.m. on weekdays. He drank after work, usually at Mulligan's Bar on 3rd Street. He didn't have friends over often, but when he did, they were usually other construction workers who drank too much and talked too loud. And yes, there was a gun in the bedroom closet on the top shelf behind the shoebox with Christmas decorations. As Tommy talked, Snake returned with information that made Bear's jaw tighten. Rick Dominguez, 34 years old. 2 arrests for domestic violence that had been pled down to disorderly conduct. 1 arrest for public intoxication. 3 complaints from neighbors about loud arguments that had been filed but never followed up on. Currently employed by Hendricks Construction, a company that paid in cash and didn't ask too many questions about their workers' backgrounds. Diesel returned from his reconnaissance with a report that made everyone in that gas station want to break something. Maria Martinez was working the lunch shift at the Route 9 diner. moving carefully like someone whose ribs were tender, favoring her left side, wearing long sleeves despite the September heat. She was beautiful, Diesel reported. But it was the kind of beauty that had been dimmed by constant fear, the way a light looks when it's been covered by too many layers of dust. "She's scared," Diesel said quietly, mindful of Tommy listening nearby. "Really scared. The kind of scared that means tonight isn't the first time." Bear felt the familiar anger rising in his chest. The same anger that had kept him alive in Vietnam and had motivated him through 40 years of protecting people who needed protecting. But this wasn't Vietnam, and anger without discipline was just destruction waiting to happen. "Here's what we're going to do," Bear said, gathering his club around him while keeping his voice low enough that Tommy couldn't hear the details. "Snake, I need you to keep an eye on Rick. Find out what bar he goes to, how much he drinks, what time he usually leaves. Don't interfere, just observe. Diesel, I need you to go back to the diner and have a conversation with Maria. Casual, friendly, maybe you're just a customer who's concerned about her well-being. Don't mention Tommy, don't mention us. Just let her know that help is available if she wants it. Preacher, I need you to contact your sources at the police department. Find out what the response time is for domestic violence calls in Maria's neighborhood, what the process looks like, whether there are any officers who might be particularly sympathetic." The plan that Bear was forming wasn't about vigilante justice. It wasn't about riding in like some biker gang from a movie and beating Rick into submission. It was about providing Maria and Tommy with options, with protection, with the resources they needed to escape safely. But if Rick chose violence, if he decided to hurt that woman and her child tonight, then the Iron Phoenix would be ready to respond. Not as outlaws, but as men who understood that sometimes the system fails and good people have to step up. "What about the boy?" Diesel asked, glancing at Tommy, who was now sitting on the floor, near the candy rack, drawing on a piece of paper Murphy had given him. Bear looked down at Tommy, saw the way the child was drawing a house with stick figures, a mommy, a little boy, and conspicuously absent, no daddy figure. The picture of a family that was incomplete but safer for its incompleteness. "Tommy's going to stay with us today," Bear decided. "He's not going back to that apartment until we know it's safe." The Route 9 diner was the kind of place that served coffee in heavy white mugs and pie that was made fresh every morning by a woman who'd been making pie for 40 years and knew the difference between good enough and perfect. It had red vinyl booths with duct tape over the tiers and a jukebox that still played songs from when music told stories instead of just making noise. Diesel walked in just after 2 p.m., during the dead period between lunch and dinner, when the only customers were truck drivers grabbing coffee and pie before their next haul. He chose a booth near the window where he could see Maria working but wouldn't make her uncomfortable with too much attention. She was everything he'd reported and worse. Up close, he could see the makeup that didn't quite cover the fading bruise on her jaw, the way she moved her left arm carefully as if her shoulder was tender, the hypervigilance that made her eyes dart toward the door every time someone entered. But he could also see her strength. The way she smiled genuinely at the elderly man at the counter, remembering that he liked his coffee light and his eggs over easy. The way she was patient with the trucker who was having trouble with English, taking the time to make sure his order was right. The way she carried herself with dignity despite whatever hell she was living at home. When she approached his table, her professional smile was warm but guarded. The smile of someone who'd learned to be friendly without being too friendly, approachable without being too approachable. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee to start," Diesel said, making sure his voice was gentle, non-threatening. "And maybe some of that pie, if it's as good as it smells." Maria poured his coffee with steady hands, though Diesel noticed the slight tremor that suggested she was running on caffeine and nerves rather than actual rest. "Apple or cherry?" "Dealer's choice. I trust your judgment." It was a small thing, telling her he trusted her judgment. But Diesel saw something flicker in her eyes at the words. When was the last time someone had trusted her judgment about anything? She brought him apple pie that was perfect, tart and sweet and still warm from the oven. When she set it down, Diesel made his move, speaking quietly so that only she could hear. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if you ever need help with anything at all, there are people who care. People who understand." Maria's hand tightened on the coffee pot. Her eyes darted around the diner, checking to see if anyone was for us. Listening, if anyone was watching. The paranoia of someone who'd learned that kindness from strangers sometimes came with a price. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Diesel reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. Not his paramedic card, but the one for the Veterans Assistance Program he volunteered with. On the back, he wrote a phone number in careful block letters. "This is for a women's shelter 2 counties over. They're good people, and they're discreet. Sometimes a person needs options, you know? Sometimes a person needs to know that help exists, even if they're not ready for it yet." Maria stared at the card for a long moment. Diesel could see the war playing out behind her eyes, hope fighting with fear, possibility wrestling with the learned helplessness that came from years of being told she was trapped. "I should get back to work," she said finally, but she palmed the card, sliding it into her apron pocket with practiced discretion. "Of course. Thanks for the pie. It's perfect." As Maria walked away, Diesel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. They'd made contact, planted a seed, given her a lifeline. But they couldn't force her to take it. All they could do was make sure that when she was ready, the help would be there. By 7 p.m., the Iron Phoenix had positioned themselves strategically around the Martinez apartment complex. They weren't obvious about it. These were men who'd learned subtlety in places where being obvious could get you killed, but they were there. Snake was in the parking lot of Mulligan's bar, watching Rick drink his way through his paycheck with the methodical determination of a man who was medicating something that couldn't be cured with alcohol. Rick was a big man, probably 220 pounds of construction worker muscle, but he was also drunk and getting drunker. Angry drunk, the dangerous kind that looked for targets to blame for his own failures. Preacher was parked across the street from the apartment complex, close enough to respond quickly, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. He'd spoken with Detective Sarah Kim at the county sheriff's office, a woman who'd worked enough domestic violence cases to understand the limitations of the law when it came to protecting victims who were too afraid to press charges. Bear was at Murphy's gas station with Tommy, who'd spent the day coloring pictures and asking questions about motorcycles and gradually opening up about the reality of his home life. The stories Tommy told were heartbreaking not just because of their content, but because of how matter-of-factly the boy recounted them. This was his normal. This was what he'd learned to expect from the adults who were supposed to protect him. "My mom cries at night sometimes," Tommy had said while coloring a picture of a motorcycle that looked suspiciously like Bear's Harley. "She thinks I can't hear her, but I can. She says my daddy's name sometimes. My real daddy, not Rick. I think she misses him." "Where's your real daddy, Tommy?" "He died when I was little. In the army." Mommy has his picture on her dresser, but Rick made her put it in a drawer because he said it was disrespectful to have dead people watching us. Bear had felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words. A fellow veteran, a man who'd served his country and died for it, and his wife and child were being terrorized by a coward who wasn't fit to shine a soldier's boots. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. When Rick came home, and he would come home angry and drunk, and looking for someone to blame, the Iron Phoenix would be ready. Not to ambush him, not to attack him, but to provide Maria and Tommy with the protection they needed to make a choice. If Maria wanted to leave, they'd help her leave safely. If she wanted to stay and call the police, they'd make sure the police responded quickly and took the situation seriously. If Rick chose to escalate, to become violent, to threaten Maria or Tommy, then the Iron Phoenix would ensure that he faced consequences for that choice. "What if my mommy doesn't want to leave?" Tommy asked, his 7-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of the problem. Bear considered his answer carefully. How do you explain to a child that sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense, that love and fear can get tangled up in ways that trap people in situations they know are harmful? Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out, Tommy. Sometimes they need to know that help is available before they're ready to take it. But here's what I promise you. You and your mommy are safe tonight. Whatever happens, you're both safe. It was a promise Bear intended to keep, whatever the cost. Rick Dominguez left Mulligan's bar at 9:47 p.m., drunk enough to be dangerous, but not so drunk that he couldn't drive. Snake followed at a distance as Rick's pickup truck weaved through the streets, toward the apartment complex, noting the aggressive way he took corners, the way he laid on the horn when other drivers didn't move fast enough for his alcohol-impaired judgment. Maria was already home, having finished her shift and picked up Tommy from Mrs. Chen's house where she thought he'd been all day. She'd found the business card Diesel had given her and stared at it for a long time, memorizing the number, thinking about possibilities she'd trained herself not to think about. Tommy was in his room, supposedly doing homework, but actually listening for the sound of Rick's truck in the parking lot. He'd heard his mother moving around the apartment with the nervous energy of someone preparing for battle, checking locks, putting away anything that might become a projectile if Rick's anger exploded. When the truck doors slammed in the parking lot, both Maria and Tommy went still. They'd learned to read the sounds the particular way Rick slammed the truck door. When he was angry, the heavy footsteps on the stairs that meant tonight would be bad. The key in the lock turned with more force than necessary. Rick burst through the apartment door like a storm front, bringing with him the smell of cigarettes and whiskey and the particular anger that comes from a man who blames everyone else for his own failures. He'd lost $200 at poker the night before, money they needed for rent, and had spent today being yelled at by his foreman for showing up late and hungover. "Where's my dinner?" he demanded, though it was nearly 10 p.m. and any reasonable person would understand that dinner would be cold or non-existent. "I can heat something up," Maria said quickly, already moving toward the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that quick compliance sometimes prevented escalation. "I don't want reheated garbage. I want fresh food. I work all day to keep a roof over your head and your bastard kid's head, and you can't even have dinner ready. When I get home..." The words hit Maria like physical blows. She'd heard them before, thousands of variations on the same theme. She was worthless. She was ungrateful. She was lucky he put up with her at all. The psychological abuse that preceded and accompanied the physical abuse, the systematic destruction of her self-worth that made it harder to believe she deserved better. "I'm sorry," she said, hating herself for apologizing, hating the automatic response that came from years of training. "I'll make something right now. Sorry doesn't fill my stomach," Rick snarled. And Maria saw the familiar signs, the way his hands were clenching into fists, the way his voice was getting louder, the way he was looking around the apartment for something to blame, something to break, someone to hurt. Tommy appeared in his bedroom doorway, drawn by the raised voices despite knowing better. He was wearing Superman pajamas that were too small for him, his dark hair sticking up from where he'd been. Lying on his pillow, his eyes wide with the fear of a child who knew what came next. "Get back in your room," Rick snapped, but Tommy didn't move. Something had changed in the boy, some spark of defiance that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the conversation with Bear. Maybe it was the knowledge that someone out there cared. Maybe it was just the desperate courage that comes when you realize that staying silent hasn't protected anyone you love. "Don't yell at Mommy," Tommy said, his voice small but clear. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Rick's face went red, then purple, the way it did when his anger went from simmering to boiling. He took a step toward Tommy, and Maria immediately put herself between them. "He's just tired," she said quickly. "Tommy, go to your room, now." But Rick wasn't interested in explanations or de-escalation. The boy had challenged him, had questioned his authority in his own house, and that couldn't be allowed to stand. "Little bastard needs to learn some respect," Rick said, pushing past Maria toward Tommy's room. That's when Maria made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of trying to negotiate or apologize or redirect Rick's anger, she stood her ground. "No," she said. Just one word, but it carried the weight of 7 years of accumulated rage, 7 years of swallowed dignity, 7 years of protecting her son while sacrificing herself. Rick stopped, turned, looked at her with genuine surprise. "Maria never said no." Maria apologized and complied and absorbed whatever anger he needed to discharge. Maria didn't challenge him. "What did you say?" "I said no. You're not going to touch my son." The slap came fast, hard enough to snap Maria's head to the side and bring tears to her eyes. But she didn't fall, didn't apologize, didn't back down. Something had broken open in her today, some dam that had been holding back years of suppressed strength. "You don't touch my son," she repeated, tasting blood from where her teeth had cut her lip. Rick's hand came up for another blow, but before it could fall, the apartment filled with the sound of motorcycle engines. Not one or two, but 10. Their combined rumble shaking the thin walls and rattling the windows. The sound of the Iron Phoenix arriving, keeping their promise. Through the window, Rick could see them 10 men in leather vests, climbing off motorcycles that looked like they could tear apart the parking lot if their riders decided that's what needed to happen. They weren't rushing, weren't shouting, weren't doing anything obviously threatening. They were just there, standing in formation, waiting. What the hell? Rick moved to the window, his alcohol-impaired brain trying to process what he was seeing. That's when Bear Morrison walked up the stairs to the apartment door and knocked. Not pounding, not demanding entry, just 3 firm knocks that somehow carried more authority than all of Rick's yelling combined. Rick opened the door with the false bravado of a drunk man who hadn't yet realized how badly he'd miscalculated. "Can I help you?" Bear looked past Rick to where Maria stood with blood on her lip and defiance in her eyes, to where Tommy was peeking around the corner with hope dawning on his 7-year-old face. "Evening," Bear said politely. "We're here to check on our friends." "Your friends?" Rick's voice rose. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to get off my property right now before I call the police." "This isn't your property," Bear said calmly. "It's Maria's apartment. Her name's on the lease. And as for calling the police," he gestured toward the parking lot where Preacher was already on his phone. "Already taken care of. They should be here in about 3 minutes." The blood drained from Rick's face as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his alcohol-soaked brain. 10 bikers in the parking lot. Police on the way. Maria bleeding but not backing down. Tommy, watching everything with eyes that were bright with something that might have been hope. "You have a choice to make, Rick," Bear continued, his voice still calm, still reasonable. "You can walk away from this apartment, get in your truck, and drive away. Find somewhere else to sleep it off. Or you can stay and explain to the police why Maria's bleeding and why there are holes in the walls and why a 7-year-old boy knows the difference between daddy's good angry and bad angry." Rick looked around the apartment, seeing it suddenly through outside eyes. The holes in the drywall that he'd punched during previous rages. The way Maria was standing protectively in front of Tommy's bedroom door. The way Tommy was looking at the bikers not with fear, but with something like relief. "This is my house," Rick said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Bear replied. "This is Maria's home, and she's asked us to help her feel safe in it." That wasn't exactly true. Maria hadn't asked for anything. But Tommy had, and in Bear's mind, that was the same thing. The sound of sirens was getting closer now, and Rick could see the flashing lights through the window. His choices were narrowing rapidly. "What guarantee do I have?" Rick asked, some last vestige of cunning breaking through the alcohol. "How do I know you won't just follow me and beat me up anyway?" Bear studied him for a moment, seeing not a monster, but a broken man who'd learned to break others instead of fixing himself. It didn't excuse what Rick had done, but it explained it in a way that made Bear feel something almost like pity. "Because we're not here for revenge, Rick. We're here for protection. You walk away tonight, you stay away, and this ends here. You come back, you threaten Maria or Tommy again, and we'll be back too. Not to hurt you, but to make sure they stay safe." It was a promise and a warning wrapped together, delivered in the tone of a man who'd kept harder promises in more dangerous places. Rick looked at Maria one last time, and for just a moment, something like regret flickered in his eyes. 7 years of a relationship built on control and fear. 7 years of using someone else's love as a weapon against them. And it was ending with him being escorted out by strangers who cared more about her well-being than he ever had. "Fine," he said finally, "but this isn't over." "Yes, it is," Maria said quietly. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "It's over, Rick. It's been over for a long time." Rick grabbed his jacket and keys, pushed past Bear with a shoulder check that the bigger man absorbed without comment, and stormed down the stairs. His truck roared to life with more noise than power, and he spun out of the parking lot just as the police cruisers arrived. Detective Sarah Kim was the kind of police officer who'd gone into law enforcement because she believed in protecting people, not because she enjoyed exercising authority. She was small, barely 5'4", but she had a presence that commanded respect and a way of talking to victims that made them feel heard rather than judged. She took Maria's statement with patience and thoroughness, documenting the years of abuse, the escalating violence, the fear that had kept Maria trapped in a situation she knew was dangerous. She photographed the fresh injuries, the old damage to the apartment, the holes in the walls that told their own story of a man who solved problems with his fists. Tommy sat on Bear's lap during the interview, finally feeling safe enough to tell the truth about what he'd witnessed, what he'd heard, what he'd lived with. His voice was small but clear as he described the nights of hiding in his closet, the morning he'd found his mother unconscious on the bathroom floor, the way Rick had taught him that love looked like fear and silence. "We can issue a restraining order," Detective Kim explained to Maria after the formal statement was complete. "Given the documented history and the witnesses present tonight, a judge will approve it. But you understand that a piece of paper can't physically protect you if he decides to violate it." Maria nodded. She'd tried restraining orders before, had learned that they were more psychological barriers than physical ones. But something was different this time. This time she wasn't facing the consequences alone. "What about housing?" Bear asked. "Is there somewhere safe she can stay while she gets back on her feet?" Detective Kim looked at the 10 bikers who'd stationed themselves around the apartment complex like an honor guard, men who clearly took their promises seriously. She'd worked enough domestic violence cases to recognize the difference between genuine protectors and vigilantes looking for an excuse to commit violence. "There's a transitional housing program through the county," she said. "Safe, secure, with counseling services and job placement assistance. The waiting list is usually 6 months, but..." She looked at Maria, saw the determination that had finally replaced the resignation. "I might be able to make some calls. I want to do this right," Maria said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. Bear, Detective Kim, Tommy, even Murphy, who'd driven over from the gas station when he heard what was happening. "I want to press charges. I want to testify. I want him to face consequences for what he did." It was a brave decision, and everyone in that room knew it. Pressing charges meant reliving the trauma in court, meant facing Rick again, meant making their private hell a matter of public record. But it also meant standing up, claiming her power back, refusing to let fear make her decisions anymore. "Are you sure?" Detective Kim asked gently. "It's not an easy process." "I'm sure," Maria said, and her voice was steady. "My son needs to see that bad behavior has consequences. He needs to see that people who hurt others don't just get to walk away." Tommy looked up at his mother with something like awe. This was a different mommy than the one who'd apologized for existing, who'd absorbed anger like a sponge absorbs water. This was the mommy he'd always known was there somewhere underneath the fear. The legal process would take months. Rick was arrested the next morning at the construction site where he worked, charged with domestic violence, assault, and child endangerment. His bail was set high enough that he couldn't make it without help, and his family had finally grown tired of enabling his behavior. Maria and Tommy moved into transitional housing 3 days later, a small apartment in a secure building with cameras and guard service, and other families who were rebuilding their lives after escaping dangerous situations. It wasn't luxurious, but it was safe, and safe felt like luxury to people who hadn't felt secure in years. The Iron Phoenix helped them move, carrying boxes and furniture with the same care they'd shown in protecting them. Bear personally carried Tommy's bed, making sure it was positioned exactly where the boy wanted it in his new room, complete with a window that looked out on a playground, instead of a parking lot where angry men slammed truck doors. But the most important transformation wasn't in their living situation, it was in Maria herself. The woman who'd been apologizing for taking up space was learning to claim her place in the world again. She enrolled in a paralegal program at the community college, determined to understand the legal system that she'd always felt worked against people like her. She started therapy, began untangling the psychological damage that years of abuse had created. Tommy thrived in ways that amazed his teachers. The quiet, hypervigilant child, who'd spent first grade watching for danger, became a second grader who raised his hand in class, who made friends, who talked about wanting to ride motorcycles when he grew up, because motorcycles meant safety, meant people who kept their promises. The trial took place 8 months later. Rick pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a sentence that included mandatory anger management, alcohol treatment, and 5 years of supervised probation with a no-contact order that would remain in effect until Tommy turned 18. Maria testified anyway, not because the legal system required it, but because she needed to speak her truth in a place where it would be officially recorded, officially heard, officially acknowledged. She stood in that courtroom wearing a dress she'd bought with money she'd earned, looking at the man who'd terrorized her for 7 years, and she told the truth. She told the truth about the fear, about the isolation, about the way abuse makes you doubt your own reality. She told the truth about the night Tommy had whispered to strangers because he believed, with the faith of a 7-year-old, that there were still people in the world who protected instead of destroyed. And when she was finished, when she'd said everything that needed saying, Maria walked out of that courtroom, a free woman in every sense of the word. The graduation ceremony at the community college was small, held in a gymnasium that doubled as a basketball court during the school year. But for Maria Martinez, walking across that stage to receive her paralegal certificate felt like walking across the world. In the audience, Tommy cheered louder than any 9-year-old should probably cheer in an academic setting, his voice carrying over the polite applause of families and friends. Beside him, Bear Morrison wiped his eyes with a bandana and pretended it was because the air conditioning was making them water. The Iron Phoenix had attended every milestone Tommy's school plays, Maria's academic awards, birthdays and holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays when they'd stopped by just to check in. They'd become family in the way that chosen family sometimes runs deeper than blood. Family, connected by shared purpose rather than shared genetics. Maria had a job waiting for her at a law firm that specialized in family law and domestic violence cases. She would help other women navigate the legal system the way she'd had to learn to navigate it, would use her experience to advocate for people who needed advocates. But on this particular Saturday morning, they were at Murphy's gas station for their monthly breakfast tradition. Tommy was 9 now, still small for his age, but carrying himself with the confidence of a child who'd learned that the world contained both dangerous people and protective people, and that he had the right to expect protection. He was telling Bear about the motorcycle he was going to buy when he turned 16, a plan that was incredibly detailed for someone who was still 3 years away from being legally allowed to drive a car. Bear listened with the patience of a man who'd learned that children's dreams were sacred things, not to be dismissed or diminished. "And I want to join your club," Tommy said seriously. "I want to help people like you helped us." "Well," Bear said, equally serious, "the Iron Phoenix always needs good men. But you've got some growing to do first. And you need to finish school, learn a trade, prove that you can keep your word when it matters." "I can keep my word," Tommy said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I kept my word about not telling anyone where we live now." It was true. Despite being 9 years old and naturally talkative, Tommy had never once slipped and mentioned their new address to anyone at school, understanding intuitively that some information needed to be protected. Maria finished her conversation with Detective Kim, who'd become not just a professional contact but a friend. Kim had used Maria's case as a training example for other officers, helping them understand how to approach domestic violence situations with both authority and compassion. As the Iron Phoenix prepared to leave for their monthly ride, Tommy ran up to Bear with a drawing he'd been working on. It showed 10 motorcycles in formation, with stick figures representing all the members of the club. At the bottom, in carefully printed letters, he'd written, "Heroes don't wear capes. They wear leather." Bear folded the drawing carefully and put it in his vest pocket, next to his heart. It would join the collection of Tommy's artwork that covered the refrigerator in his own kitchen, drawings that reminded him every day why the Iron Phoenix existed, why some promises were worth keeping no matter what they cost. "Ready to ride?" Diesel asked, already swinging his leg over his motorcycle. "Ready?" Bear confirmed, but before he started his engine, he walked over to Maria, who was standing by her car, watching the ritual she'd seen dozens of times, but never tired of witnessing. "You know you saved yourself, right?" Bear said quietly. "Tommy whispered to us, but you're the one who found the deluge. Strength to say no. You're the one who chose to press charges. You're the one who rebuilt your life. We just provided a little protection while you did the hard work." Maria smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to the eyes and transforms a face. "Maybe, but it's easier to be brave when you know someone has your back." "You'll always have our backs," Bear promised. "Tommy too. When he's old enough, if he still wants to join the club, we'll teach him everything we know about protecting people who need protecting." The engines roared to life in sequence. That familiar thunder that had once announced salvation to a terrified woman and her child. Now it announced something else, the continuation of a promise, the ongoing commitment to stand between the strong and the weak, the powerful and the vulnerable. As the Iron Phoenix rode away into the Montana morning, Maria and Tommy stood together in the parking lot of Murphy's gas station, watching their chosen family disappear around the bend in the road. They would be back next month, and the month after that, and every month for as long as Maria and Tommy needed them. But the truth was, Maria and Tommy didn't need rescuing anymore. They'd become their own heroes, their own protectors, their own source of strength. The Iron Phoenix had given them the time and space to remember who they were underneath the fear, and what they'd remembered was that they were survivors. Tommy still drew pictures of motorcycles, but now he also drew pictures of himself in a graduation cap, in a police uniform, in a lawyer's suit. Pictures of the man he was going to become, shaped by the knowledge that strength meant protection, that power meant responsibility, that real heroes were the people who showed up when they were needed most. And somewhere on the road ahead, Bear Morrison smiled as he felt the wind against his face and the rumble of his Harley beneath him. Behind them, they'd left a woman and her son who were safe, who were free, who understood their own worth. Ahead of them, the road stretched out endless and full of possibility, full of people who might need them, might need someone to believe that help was possible even when it seemed impossible. The Iron Phoenix would keep riding, keep watching, keep their promise that when all else fails, good people don't have to stand alone. Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and triumph is just someone willing to listen when a 7-year-old boy whispers, "They're hurting mommy tonight," and someone willing to do something about it. The thunder of 10 motorcycles faded into the distance, but the echo of their promise lingered. When all else fails, the Iron Phoenix flies. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.